Hello, everyone. Welcome to BookTrib Live, a Merrill Moss media production. Today we have the absolute pleasure of chatting face-to-face with Beatriz Williams, the New York Times bestselling author of 100 Summers and the Secret Life of Violet Grant. And her new novel, Tiny Little Things, just hit bookstores, and she was kind enough to stop and to talk with us today in between stops on her book tour. So welcome to the BookTrib headquarters.
Thank
We're
you.
so excited to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
This beautiful book
Yes.
here. We're happy to announce that we're giving away signed copies of Tiny Little Things, signed by Beatriz herself. So before I start my questions, would you mind telling us a little more about Tiny Little Things?
Tiny Little Things. So if you had told me 3-4 years ago that I would be writing a book set in the 1960s, I would have said you were crazy because I write historical fiction and that's my wheelhouse. And when I think of historical fiction, certainly anything before World War II is kind of how I end up. But I backed into it a little bit. It's a bit of a spin-off of my previous book, The Secret Life of Violet Grant. It stands alone, but it is a bit of a spin-off because it deals with the sister of Vivian, who was the character in 1964 who goes back and solves this mystery. So she dismisses her older sister Tiny as being this little Miss Perfect living in Boston, married into this very politically ambitious Boston family. And as soon as I wrote that, I knew that Perfect Little Tiny was hiding a very big secret. So I knew that was going to be the next book. Hooray! And then I sat down a year later and started writing. And it's really about Tiny. It opens up in 1966. She's just gotten a blackmail note with some incriminating photographs. And her husband at the time is just launching his congressional campaign for the House of Representatives. And so she gets this blackmail note and it refers to this indiscretion in her past. 2 years ago, a couple weeks before her wedding, when Tiny falls in love for the very first time in her life with a man not the one she's about to get married to. So we kind of all these step bubbles to the surface, and then of course the man turns up in that summer on Cape Cod in 1966, and all kinds of things happen.
Great, and you mentioned the Schuyler sisters, and they're in the previous books. Can you tell us a little bit about their different personalities, like bring us up to speed about the differences?
And it's actually pronounced Schuyler because it's a Dutch name, and I specifically I kind of met the Schuylers in, and there actually is an old Dutch family in New York called the Schuylers. Then I just picked a Dutch name to refer to the older families in New York tended to have these distinguished Dutch names because of the early settlers. So it was a prestige thing, and I wanted to reference that. So yes, the Schuylers, I had so much fun with them in 100 Summers because they're just so deliciously dysfunctional. And that is just such a great playground for a novelist because, anything can happen, and these characters are so fun in their dysfunction. So yes, the Vivian and Pepper and Tiny are all Schuyler's. Vivian, she appeared first in The Secret Life of Violet Grant, and she is this kind of smart mouth, kind of, and my agent hates the word sassy, but I have to use it here. She's kind of sassy. She's definitely got some wit and just a lot of nerve. She's really a fun person to be around. She's someone you want to go to a dinner party with. And her middle sister Pepper is a lot like her. Tiny is completely different. She's a perfect older child. So yes, they have a certain amount of disdain for each other.
Right. And the war during this time in 1966 has a big impact on the storyline and some of the characters. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. So, of course, born in the 1960s, and like I said, I kind of backed into it. So, it was not something that I was, passionately studied. I know about as much about Vietnam War and politics in the 1960s as the next person. But obviously, if you're setting something in the 60s, you have all this social change going on. It's rubbing up against, the traditional, the return to traditionalism from the post-war period. So Vietnam War comes in because partly because I needed an excuse to have Caspian, the man that she falls in love with, go away for 2 years and then reappear. War is a great way for that to happen. And if he has to go to war, he's got a good excuse. So, I said, okay, let's put him in the Vietnam War. And of course, at the time, between 1964 and 1966, it was only really special forces. We were not officially there yet, so it was special forces. They were active kind of along the Laos border. So that's where I placed him, and I had him come back 2 years later as a war hero. In fact, the first scene, I deliberately had it be on television.
Yes.
They walk in, they're all gathered around the television watching the Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony, the White House, the Rose Garden with Walter Cronkite. I chose that deliberately because the 1960s were kind of a watershed in terms of politics, where you had television everywhere. All of a sudden, the visual image becomes vitally important to you as a politician. Enter in 1960 this young, glamorous couple into the White House, and they're beautiful. It's this combustion that creates this culture of celebrity politics that exists today, where we care way more about what the politicians' wives are wearing than about what's in their heads. Get started on that.
I know. Glamorizing everything.
Exactly.
So Tiny is a political wife, and she's living in the Mad Men era. Do you watch that show? Are you a fan of it? Were you inspired by it at all?
Actually, completely zero, because I have no TV in the house. This was not a conscious decision. I know, it's funny. It's just one of those coincidences. We just sort of, the TV broke, and we waited a little while, to get a new one, and then all of a sudden we noticed the kids' reading scores were going up, and I was getting more done. I'm very busy writing books and having more kids, so we said, maybe we just have one for emergencies, and we try not to watch. So I'll watch it now be on my iPad, and that's about it. Super Bowl, work it out.
Exactly.
If there's an earthquake somewhere.
Yeah, and the grandmother in the story, I really like her. She's very into the politics, and I love the scene in the beginning when they're saying how she doesn't want a new TV. She's kind of behind the times on that, but she definitely is she kind of rules the roost. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yes, well, every politically ambitious family, of course, requires a matriarch, and matriarchs are really fun to write because they are, and patriarchs actually, they're fun to write because they are just so Machiavellian. And yet, they're kind of doing it for the best reasons. They're doing it not for their own glory necessarily, but for the family, And it's this whole, and I certainly I was not at all trying to rewrite the Kennedys here. I kind of used that as a starting point just because I was trying to reach some of those issues about celebrity politics and this glamorization of politics. So I was trying to access that a bit. And because I had sort of, Vivian had said that she was married to a Boston political family, I sort of, I was stuck with that because Violet Grant was already in galleys at that point. So I said, okay, this is where I am. But it was, and it was, obviously, you have this political family, so you have really someone who, because of, and certainly a woman would not obviously be able to run the country herself. So there's a certain amount of, she's channeling all her ambition into others, and ambition into her son, first of all, and that doesn't quite work out. And so her grandson now is the one that, they're sort of pushing him into the political area. And, to what extent this is selfish, to what extent it's this sort of, for the good of the family.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of it. You never get really inside Granny's head because you're looking at her through Tiny's eyes. Yeah. So maybe at some point I'll have to give her a little bit more of her own voice instead of the filter of the narrator that she's having to deal with in this book.
I would love to see that. And Tiny is really funny to me. I love her sense of humor. I laughed out loud. She's dry, sarcastic, kind of biting wit, and it's also tinged with a little sadness and bitterness. I love this quote. When I was about 8 years old, my mother, in a rare fit of maternal attention, she must have been between lovers, enrolled me in my first ballet class. So when you're kind of channeling a character's sense of humor, is it always a bit of your own? Do you ever find that you're making this character, like, where is this coming from? This is not like me at all. I always find that interesting.
It is funny, and Tiny, one of the things that the themes that I'm trying to develop in this book is the fact that she's wearing a mask, and the fact we're all wearing masks, and some of the characters at first appear to be sort of cliches, how we expect them to be, but I'm trying by sort of hints and clues because, of course, again, we're looking through certainly 1966 through Tiny's eyes, so I'm limited in how much I can draw out the character. But I'm trying to show that, in fact, these people have something else going on inside. Frank Hardcastle, that's Tiny's husband, so much going on the inside, and we only scratch the surface of that. Tiny
is
only able to scratch the surface of that because she doesn't understand him, and he doesn't understand her.
Sure of himself.
Exactly. So when I have a voice that comes out of a character, it, obviously it has to be part of me. But I'll never forget when I was first writing Vivian, and Tiny's Vivian's sister, and they all kind of share a little bit of that. That Schuyler spirit, and Pepper as well, and I just never forget. I was actually sitting on the porch of a very dear friend of mine, Karen White, who writes amazing Southern fiction. We've become good friends, and I was down on the porch in her beach house having a writing weekend, and I'm on the porch and writing, Vivian's first scene, and there's this post office, and I'm literally laughing out loud, and she's like, "What are you cackling about over there?" And I said, "It's this character," and they are actually really easy to write because they kind of lay it out. It's a voice that is easy for me to slip into, even though it's not the voice that I naturally have. At least certainly not without a glass or two of wine.
On your girls' weekend.
Exactly, and then it all comes out.
Now the name Caspian is so unique, and I thought immediately, I was like, oh, Prince Caspian. I'm thinking of like Narnia and C.S. Lewis. How did you choose that name?
That's a great story. I'm so glad you asked. I did not choose it actually. So if we scroll back to 100 Summers, my daughter Anna, when I was first writing that book, I was getting going, and I hadn't named the main character yet. And my daughter, who I think was like only 8 or 9 at the time, said, "Oh, Mom, you promised me that I could name the character in your next book." And I was like, "I don't recall making any such a rash promise." But she insisted, and she said, "Lily." And I said, "Actually, that's the perfect name for this character." So I'm getting started on Tiny Thing, and my son walks up, who's a year and a half older than she is, and they're fiercely competitive. And he says, "Anna got to name the character in 100 Summers, so it's my turn to name a character." And I'm a little worried because he is extremely imaginative, into Lord of the Rings, and oh God, it's going to be like, one of the exactly. And he said Caspian, and I'm sure he was referencing Narnia. And I said, that's the perfect name. And of course, you get a great nickname, Cap, which kind of actually reminds me of Little House on the Prairie. Cap was a bit of a crush of mine. Cap and Elmo too. They were the.
I'm glad I asked that.
Exactly, they were the business. So yes, I was. I wouldn't have said yes to it if it weren't the right name. But I was glad that he came up with it, because I would have come up with it, and it does reference that sort of certain amount of heroic nature and leadership nature as well. And, to shout out to Cap from, little town in the prairie dogs, but they're the ones who go out and like get the wheat, for the starving town in the long winter. I know. So it was a good,
fantastic. So your book tour, you're currently in the throes of that. Can you fill us in where you've been so far, where you're going?
I just moved actually, and I'm still in Connecticut, but I moved from sort of one end of Connecticut to the other, still on the shore. Just a little more quiet and rural. But I did that actually not this week, a week ago basically. So I've been in there for a week, and so I thought my books are usually released in May, so I thought it was clear, but no, the release date turned out to be June 23rd. I said, well, maybe we can keep me kind of somewhat local for this book tour, otherwise my husband, may not be around when I get back. So, exactly. So, I just actually came back. I've done a lot of local visits, and I just came back from the Historical Novel Society conference in Denver, which was fabulous.
Denver.
Yes, Denver's great. I actually have relatives there, so I took an extra day to say hello to them. And now tonight I'll be at the Wilton Library in Connecticut. Let's see, and then tomorrow, actually leaving for the Cape, I got a couple of dates there at some great bookstores. And then the Toadstool in New Hampshire. That's actually owned by my husband's uncle. It's a wonderful independent bookseller. And I've got a few more local dates. And then I've got one little trip down to the DC area. And
we actually have a list of where she's headed to on BookTrib on the live chat page. So if anyone's
yes. And it's my first trip. I'm going to Arlington for the first time. So those of you who've been like, why don't you ever come down here? This is your chance, and I really hope to see you all.
That's great. And so what are some really incredible experiences that you've had when doing book tours or conferences and just interacting with fans? Does anything kind of stick out with you?
Oh gosh, I've had so many, and some of them are really personal stories, so I don't necessarily want to share them. But when I was actually on tour for 100 Summers, somebody came up to me at a bookstore and just told me that she'd read overseas the year before at a very vulnerable moment for her, and it was the only thing that kept her going in this moment, and that's when I realized, and I'm a big opera fan, actually. I was sort of raised on it as a child. And I remember once I was listening to one of my favorite recordings, and the tenor, and I'd heard, as I grew up, that he's a great tenor, but he, had a little fun here and there, as we would definitely disapprove of. But then I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to be somebody who could bring such joy to others? And at the end of the day, at the end of your life, whatever sins you've committed, and we're all, human weakness, that you can say, hey, at least I made a difference to people, and not in, but just bringing people joy. And I think that it's such I just feel so incredibly blessed to be able to do that, to be in a position where I can not only just, help people get through their beach day, which is, very important, but also, give them a story at perhaps a difficult time in their lives that can just help to give them strength and inspire them, and at least distract them. If that's the least I can do, I feel it's such a privilege.
It's great to be able to escape at any time.
And escape, and do not, the value of escape is, I think, way overlooked. It's, I think it's essential to us. Human beings were storytellers. That's how, I was an anthropology major, and I find I get so much out of that, that I put into my writing, because, that's how we make sense of the world, is through stories and myths, and as much as you can draw on that, and that human element, that's there in the myth making. I think it's just so important for storytelling, and it's just, I feel like it's kind of a noble calling in a way.
Certainly. And speaking of Beatriz and escaping, so Shelf-Awareness said that Tiny Little Thing is filled with delicious scandals, catty socialites, true love. This Beatriz deserves pride of place in every vacationer's tote bag.
Ooh, I didn't hear that one. Yay! Good to hear.
So, what books have found their way into your beach tote bag? Is there anything that you are dying to read, have on your to-be-read shelf?
My to-be-read shelf right now is so high, and everyone's raving about The Nightingale, so I definitely, as soon as I get settled and the stuff's unpacked, I definitely have to read that, partly because it is in my, my zone. My next book, which is dealing with pepper, is in the lead up to the Second World War in Europe. It's in the late 1930s, and then, of course, pepper in 1960s. So I kind of feel like I've never done a World War II book, and I'm kind of getting close now, and so I'm really excited to read that one. And then, of course, the history stuff. But some of the great stuff I can't even tell you about, really, because I get these advanced copies now of books, too, and they're usually books that I love to read anyway, so it's very exciting. I will say this, I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of Melanie Benjamin's next book, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, which is about Truman Capote and the Fifth Avenue social set, and that's actually not out until December, but I can tell you now it's really, really good. Really enjoyed that one.
He's fascinating. I took a course
in
high school. It was just from
he is, yes. Yeah, he's really, really interesting guy, and especially he leads this very frivolous, Fifth Avenue social life, and then you read In Cold Blood, and you're like, it's wow, what is, I'm sure it was a very interesting character to dissect, from the author's point of view.
We had a question pop up. You just reminded me just about like the historical parts and the war and everything in your books, and we had a question pop up from a viewer, which happens. We get spontaneous questions that we love from Debbie, and she says that every time she reads your book, it's so authentic, and it like is portrayed so vividly. Like, how do you do that? Is there a lot of research that goes into it historically?
Well, there is a lot of research, but it's not necessarily where I sit down for that book specifically and read about the period, because it's usually about a period that I'm more interested in. So I'm saying that I really spend most of my adult life reading about. So it's kind of soaked into my bones. And my philosophy with historical fiction is that the history is really the stage setting on which a human drama is being enacted. So I am not there to hit you over the head with, the club of history here. It should be seamlessly integrated into the story, so that I don't have to give you a paragraph or two of just, history in order for you to understand what's going on. I try to drop it into conversation. But if you're sitting there in, say, 1938 in Europe, you kind of know what's going on, and somebody in dialogue giving you a rundown of the politics is kind of artificial. So I try to do it as subtly as possible. Just a few words, a single detail, something that, you know, would be natural to the characters who are actually living in that period.
I think the difference between men and women in a tiny little thing, I noticed you say the women walk around with their slippers when the men aren't home, or then Tiny's having whiskey, but her husband's not home, and there's no vodka on the cocktail table for her because women don't drink in bed. It's ridiculous. But, you know, I just love those little things you put in there, this subtle little
Yes, that's whole sort of 19, again, it's a detail. I think every sort of detail that counts.
Now, have you ever collaborated with another author on anything?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've got a book coming out. I mentioned Karen White and The Porch and Caspian over Vivian. So Karen has become a dear friend of mine. It's one of the wonderful things about this writing adventure is you meet writers who are just like you, and you become sort of instant best friends. And my other very dear friend, Lauren Willig, who writes she writes the Pink Carnation series, The Secret History of the Pink Carnation, about Napoleonic spies. And she also writes standalone historical fiction. She wrote Ashford Park in that summer, and her latest book, The Other Daughter, is out this summer. So she and Karen and I actually got together because we all three of us switched back and forth between two narratives, or sometimes even three. And so we thought, hey, maybe we could do this together. So each of us took one of the narratives, and it's woven together the way it is in our books, alternating chapters. And it's set around a Gilded Age mansion on the Upper East Side of New York City. So one of us wrote the Gilded Age part, one of us wrote the 20s part, one of us wrote the 40s part. And that's actually out in January.
Ooh, exciting.
Yes, it's called The Forgotten Room, and we're super excited, and Penguin's really excited about it. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I was wondering if you had it before, or, you know, if you're going to, because I can see you definitely, you know, doing some historical type of interweaving with someone else.
Yes, and we had the most fun writing it. And I even learned, you know, we ended up having, none of us tend to sort of do detailed outlines before we write, but we really had to with this one because our narratives reference each other. So we kind of did this detailed outline, and you know, it was kind of useful to sit down and be like, okay, I'm writing this chapter now, and here's what happens. Let's get to work. You know, it was a little bit easier to slip right in.
Now, I had a question just about your process, because in The Secret Life of Violet Grant, that's a saga, and it spans, it's 2 continents, 5 decades, among this family. So how do you organize that and keep it straight in your head? Are you kind of a seat-of-your-pants writer, and then you go back and check it, like double-check?
Well, I'm a little bit in the sense that I know where my starting point is. I know where I want to end up, and I know some major points along the way. But I do like to leave a lot to serendipity. Serendipity plays a big role, I think, in writing. And so, when I'm writing this dual narrative, which is what I usually do in my books, I usually do I always do each narrative on its own. In the case of The Secret Life of Violet Grant, the central mystery takes place in 1914. So I wrote that section first, actually right up until sort of a critical moment where I'm like, okay, I'm really not sure how to get from this point to the ending that I want. So that was when I went back and wrote Vivian's part. I felt I knew enough about what happened in 1914 that I could now write Vivian, in which she's sort of solving this mystery. And then about a third of the way through, Vivian's doing something, sort of sorting through some of these artifacts that come out of the suitcase that she's been sent from 1914. And I said, oh my gosh, that's the solution. And then I just kind of raced through the rest of Vivian's part, and then I went back to Violet and wrote those last few scenes that so that was really a lot of fun, and it's really how I like to write. I feel like I always want to have a great ending, and sometimes you need to work through this before. I feel like it's kind of this sort of perfect ending that is out there, and I just need to find it. I just need to hunt it down and capture it. And that's, to me, what the writing process is.
The journey. Do you find the beginning harder to write?
Yes, definitely the beginning. Because in the beginning, I'm still a little bit swimming, and you kind of have these characters in your head, but until you are sitting there writing them on the page, you really don't know them. And I'm kind of an introvert. I need to get to know somebody a little bit. So, and I'm, writing, my next book now, struggling a little bit with those first chapters, just like, what's it, especially when you're dealing with more, introverted characters or characters who have something to hide. You're trying to access that, and they're not letting you because they're trying to hide even from you. I know this sounds crazy to be a little cuckoo, but if they're not letting you in, the characters, it's a little bit of a struggle. Like, what is your authentic voice? Who are you? You interesting character. So I just have to trust it's going to work out. We'll get there. Just keep plugging away until everybody slowly illuminates, or else flashes on.
So, what's one of the best pieces of advice that you've ever received about writing?
This is interesting. Actually, I would say this. The best piece of advice I got when I very, very, very first started getting serious about writing, which is when my third child was a toddler. And I said, kind of now's the time, or else I'm just going to get too into my routine, my mom routine. So a friend of my husband's, his wife is a long-time science fiction editor. So I had lunch with her, and it was obviously no expectations because she's a science fiction editor, so she knew I wasn't going to pitch her. So she was able to, and she said, well, what do you like to write? And I said, historical fiction, some sort of love story element there, a mystery, something really rich. And she said, well, you should think about joining the Romance Writers Association. And I had read a lot of romance in high school and college and loved it. And then, I just got so busy and, I sort of dropped it for a while. And so I said, but I really, I don't feel like I'm writing like, romance. And she said, it's a big tent. And it's, it's not just focused on, romance. And it's anyone who's got a love story in their book. And I said, hey, so, and the other thing is, it's so powerful. So many editors and agents go to the conference every year. They put on great workshops about storytelling and the craft. So it turned out to be just a great fit, and I made some amazing friends. I picked up a lot of romance novels and had a lot of fun reading those again. Certainly in that 15-year gap, there's been a lot of change in romance. So it was a lot of fun kind of catching up on the genre.
You meet so many people too.
Exactly.
Speaking of just meeting authors and networking, do you have any other events coming up besides the book tour that you have anything in the hopper coming up?
Well, actually, one thing I'm really excited about is I was invited to join Nora Roberts, and she does twice a year. She has a big book signing event at the bookstore she owns in Boonesboro, Maryland. And she always asks a few other authors to join her. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to be July 18th, I want to say. I think, July 18th. So it's a Saturday, and there's going to be some really big names there. I'm going to be, very starstruck, and I'll be there with
Oh, it's so
exactly. I know, it's so pretty. It's very show-offable cover.
Did you have any input on the cover?
Well, what they do, and there's a wonderful art department at Cape Cod. They did a fabulous job. They gave me the very almost iconic 100 Summers cover, which I think sold us a lot of books. And so they gave us a couple of options, and the editor sends it, and she always sends it to my agent as well, because my fabulous agent, Alexander Machinist at ICM, has a great eye for these things, and she's told me, what, just don't respond to these, jacket photo, emails without consulting me first. So yes, it's our rule. And I said, I really like that one in the red dress. And she's like, I think so too. She says it's an A cover. So we went with it, and I love the way it turned out because it's got a really kind of velvety feel to it. Yes, the whatever silver stuff. It's strokeable. It's really so soft. Yes. So I know, and it's funny. Somebody was saying there's so many blue covers now, so it does kind of stand out as well because it's it's obviously got a very warm red and a cream tone also. Exactly.
Now, where can we find you on social media so that we can keep up to date?
Yes, I'm mostly on Facebook at the moment, and here I am in the middle of trying to promote a book, and I've been so far behind on posting because I come home, I try to unpack a box or two, and then I'm off for the next event, and then I go to bed, and I can't even think straight at that point. So, and I try also to spend an hour or two with my family as well. So here I am in the middle of promotion season, and I have not been posting as much as I should. But I am on Facebook. I have a page there, and I love hearing from fans. I'll always respond. It may take me a little while at the moment, but I always respond. Twitter, BC Williams Books is my Twitter handle. I am now on Instagram. They kind of drag me on, and it's fun, but you can get so absorbed in those filters. You're like, how can I tweak this photo? I haven't perfected my duck out either. I can't kind of get that. You're supposed to. Is your head supposed to be down or up? I can't even remember. See, and it's like second. I have a 12-year-old girl, and I have a feeling she's got. Okay, Mom, here you go. So what you do is this. She'll do an Instagram.
Instagram is addictive. It absolutely is.
I know. So I think it's author Beatriz Williams, or else Beatriz Williams author. One of those. I think it's author Beatriz Williams. Yes.
So what are you working on next? This is our last question. We want to hear what's coming up without telling us too much. Don't give away too much, but
I will not, because there's always a mystery there. So I'll give you the setup. Well, if you read A Tiny Little Thing at the end, there's a bit of a dangling thread, and that's because of good old Pepper. She tends to walk onto the page and take it over.
Yes.
So I had to give her own subplot, which involves a vintage Mercedes, a 1936 Mercedes Special Roadster that she discovers abandoned in a shed on Tiny's Cape Cod property. And Tiny has no idea how it got there. So there's kind of a side plot as she's restoring this car and trying to figure out what happened to it. And there's kind of a dangling thread left at the end. Because Pepper, by the way, arrives into this book, arrives in Tiny's house for the summer, and she is hiding a very big secret of her own, which further complicates Tiny's life. So the next book is actually out in November, and it is, again, we pick up Pepper's story, and it goes back and forth between Pepper in 1966, dealing with her big problem, and 1930s Europe, when this car was slowly making its way to that shed on Cape Cod. If you've read 100 Summers, as I was about to write this book, I was like, oh, who's in Europe in the 1930s and involved in, involved in politics there is Nick Greenwald from 100 Summers. So he's in there. It was so much fun to write. I mean, this is like I have this great big love story that spans decades and continents, and it's really, I had so much fun writing this. And that's out in November. It's called Long Sea.
Oh, excellent. That's so exciting.
That's the next one. I know. I had a lot of fun.
Awesome. It was so nice to chat with you.
Great chatting with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we are giving away copies of Tiny Little Thing.
Yes.
You're going to go sign.
I will sign.
Yes.
Whatever you want.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.